Hello, and thank you for listening to this episode of Careful Consideration. I'm Dustin Burden, and this is my careful consideration of issues at the intersection of ethics, culture, and theology. My goal with this podcast is to help Christians be a moral witness in society, but I also want to help non-Christians see the beauty of God through ethics and morality. And in this episode, I'd like us to continue reasoning together as we consider another cultural moral issue. It's going to be concerning transgenderism. This will probably be a 3-part series where I cover transgenderism. Before I dive into the content, I always like to give this disclaimer before I talk about any LGBTQ issues such as homosexuality or transgenderism, because I always want to make it clear that I am not trying to demean or belittle anyone who feels as though they identify as transgender. And I believe as Christians, we should never have as our goal to argue down or verbally beat down or belittle those who are identifying as some form of the LGBTQ community. Now, having said that, I strongly disagree with homosexuality and transgender ideologies, and I do want to share those concerns from a Christian ethical perspective. But again, the goal here is not to attack people, it is to attack the idea of transgenderism, and I want to actually help people who maybe identify as transgenderism. This episode and the next will be more so foundational, where we will cover ways to think about transgender theory as it is at least portrayed currently in modern Western society. In the third and final episode, I will shift to some practical principles of how we could help someone that is caught up in this false hope trap of transgenderism. So I want to call this first episode How We Can Understand Transgenderism and Its Possible Causes. America is dealing with a gender identity crisis. I believe there would be no need to prove that point out. Many youths and adults alike are wrestling with gender identity issues in our culture. Those of us who are not dealing with gender identity issues are still left to wade through this cultural issue and decide where we stand. Some believe the current gender identity issue is a problem to address, while others see it as a significant advancement in modern society's understanding of gender. In either case, the debate over gender identity can confuse onlookers. Christianity is not immune to the gender identity debate. Some adolescents raised in church are wrestling with these issues also. Some young people who profess faith in Christ maybe were raised in Christian homes and churches later come out as transgender. Well, what are Christians to make of this? Well, I want to begin here by exploring the gender identity crisis, or I'm going to probably just call it transgenderism, but I want to make the point clear. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, gender identity issues or transgenderism. Well, I want to look at transgenderism in America and offer this introductory framework for addressing it as Christians. I'll sort of speak as though I'm focusing more on youth than I am adults, but the truth is the principles I share apply to both groups equally. And here, I want to begin with explaining what transgenderism is, then look at some data about the current gender identity issue in America, and examine what could be some possible causes for transgenderism. Because especially those of you listening who are Christians, we need to be aware of the key issues with transgenderism, so not, again, we can win arguments, but so we can respond with truth, love, and grace as based on the character of Jesus Christ. Our goal should never be, again, I want to keep repeating this a little bit more, but our goal should never be to demean people, but in the interest of helping people caught up in this gender confusion crisis, we need a way to speak the truth with a heart of love and a tone of grace. Well, let's look first at the very basics of transgenderism. What is transgenderism? According to the American Psychological Association, transgenderism, or you could say the word transgender, it is, quote, an umbrella term used to describe the full range of people whose gender identity and or gender role do not conform to what is typically associated with their sex assigned at birth, end quote. And that is a quote directly from the American Psychological Association's online dictionary. So, in other words, a transgender person feels different than the gender they were born with. Transgenderism means a person's self-perceived, that's the key, it's a person's self-perceived gender identity. The issue is for them, it does not conform to their birth gender. So the word transgender uses the Latin word trans, which means across or to go across. Thus, transgender means someone's gender identity or expression can go across a gender spectrum between male and female. Often people believe that when someone says they're transgender, they'll automatically make it too simplistic, and they will think that what that person means is they are identifying as the opposite gender from the one they were born with. Well, transgenderism is more than that. It can mean that, but it can also mean a lot more than that. You see, modern gender theory argues that gender is non-binary, meaning it is more than just male or female. Instead, they would have us believe that gender is on a spectrum, and this spectrum has on the far ends male and female. But according to modern gender theory, a person can identify with a gender anywhere along that spectrum between male and female. In fact, modern gender theory asserts that gender is not male or female. Gender could be male and female. A transgender person could be someone born a male who identifies as a female. It could be that simple, or vice versa. It could be someone that was born biologically a female who identifies as a male. However, though, I just want to keep making this point clear. It could be, though, that the person is identifying with some mixture even of male and female. Modern gender theory claims gender is more complex than male or female. There can be a host of gender expressions that contain mixtures of male and female, or even something beyond male and female. I found a website that claimed as many as 107 different gender identities in the year 2024. If you interact with someone identifying as transgender, do not assume anything about their perceived gender identity. Their identity could be as simple as a boy who wants to be a girl, or a girl who wants to be a boy, but their identity could be something much more complex. It could involve them feeling like they are parts male and parts female, mixtures of both of those. Again, all I'm saying here is don't assume that you have the person figured out if they approach you or you engage in a conversation with them and they say, "Oh, I'm transgender." Just don't automatically assume you know everything about what they are going to say that they are. Let them first sort of explain out what they are feeling and that their expression should be. Well, that leads me to this next important term called gender dysphoria. This is an important term to know for the transgender debate. Psychiatrists define gender dysphoria as distress due to, quote, marked incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and assigned gender of at least 6 months duration, and it can vary in degrees of intensity, end quote. That is a quote directly from the American Psychiatric Association. So gender dysphoria is a technical term here. It is when a person's desire to be a gender other than the one they were born with, that desire becomes so severe and so strong to the degree it begins to cause them some form of mental distress. Again, to some degree. It could be mild or it could be extreme. But what psychiatrists look for here to label someone as gender dysphoria is, again, their incongruence, we can say, meaning the parts they were born with does not match their self-perception of the gender that they should be expressing. That divergence, that incongruence is strong enough in their mind that it begins to cause them mental problems, mental stress at a minimum, or extreme mental issues at a very more higher level. If they begin to experience that for at least 6 months, they can then be labeled technically with this psychiatric issue of gender dysphoria. Okay, now I want to make this clear. Not every transgender person experiences gender dysphoria. You see, someone who identifies as transgender, they may be somewhat comfortable with that. And that means they're not experiencing any mental distress about it. Well, then they're not going through gender dysphoria. So if you interact with someone who identifies as transgender, it's crucial to keep this in mind as well. They could be at ease with that. They may have accepted it and moved on, or they might be experiencing some internal mental distress over their self-perceived transgender identity. Just keep those in mind, and it can maybe help us have more efficient conversations with people. Well, let's look at some data over the gender identity crisis. When we look at the data about the gender identity issue, it does paint a picture of what we face. Now, this data is specific to the United States of America. The United States does not have a centralized reporting system, so the data is sometimes scattered. We have to rely upon states to voluntarily report data or rely upon independent organizations to conduct their research. Well, we do have some data, though, that lets us form a pretty reliable picture of what's going on. Gallup polling in the year 2022 estimates that 0.6% of the U.S. adult population identifies as transgender. Data also suggests the 18 to 29-year-old age group contains the most transgender people. One study also found that 53% of 18 to 29-year-olds personally know someone who is transgender. The number of people who know someone who is transgender, and this is regardless of age, it just keeps growing. In 2017, a report indicated that only 5% of Americans personally knew someone who identifies as transgender. But get this, 4 years later, in the year 2021, that number grew in a similar study to 42% of the U.S. population personally knows someone who is transgender. I would argue the numbers are still growing every year. So the point is, it is more likely now than ever before that you and I know someone personally who is either questioning their gender identity or has come right out and said they are transgender. So as Christians, we cannot avoid this issue anymore. It is becoming a growing mission field for the church, for sure. Gender identity issues are not unique to youths either. It's a major growing problem for youth-aged Americans, though. A report from the Williams Institute at UCLA in 2022 found that nearly 1 in 5 people, that's 18%, of youth aged 13 to 17 identify as transgender. Reuters News and Komodo Health Systems released data in 2022 that shares what I would call a depressing picture for adolescents dealing with gender identity issues. I have a written article where I've posted this on my website. If you want to go to that written article, it'll be under the same title as this podcast episode's title. I point that out because I put graphs of this data there, and you can actually see they track the data from the year 2017 to the year 2021, and you can see the ever-increasing number of cases. In the first graph, I show the diagnoses of youth with that term I told you, gender dysphoria. Well, in 2017, it was 15,000, just over 15,000. That doesn't sound like much. I mean, that's for the whole country of America. But in 2021, there were 42,000 cases diagnosed of gender dysphoria in America. And this is just of youth ages 6 to 17. So the number doesn't sound like much, but the rate of growth every year is crazy increasing. That is the issue I want to draw attention to, is when you factor in that rate of increase, it paints that there is a surge in gender dysphoria cases. Sometimes these adolescents that are diagnosed with gender dysphoria, they will be treated with puberty blockers. Those are the medications that prevent the child's body from naturally producing their birth gender's hormones and cause their body to overcompensate by producing the opposite gender's hormones. So, for example, if someone is born a male but they identify as a female and they are diagnosed with gender dysphoria, again, meaning it's causing them severe mental distress, And so their counselors and psychiatrists say, hey, the best thing for this adolescent would be we put them on puberty blockers. Well, what that would do for this male, this biological male, is it would cause his body to stop producing testosterone, at least slow it down significantly, and it would then cause the body to overproduce estrogen, the feminine hormones. That is how they believe they're helping this child, because they're saying, well, if it causes them distress, then we'll put them on medication that will let their body begin to in some ways let them appear to be the opposite gender that they think they want to identify as. So this male would begin to grow feminine features physically in their body. I mean, they might even start developing breasts even and things like that. And that sounds crazy, but again, that is the current psychiatric theory for how to quote, help. I don't think it's helping at all, but I'll touch on that in a future episode. But that is their way that they may treat someone with severe gender dysphoria. And again, these are minors here. We're talking people under age 18. Well, here's some numbers for the puberty blockers that have been given in the country. In the year 2017, this again is coming from Komodo Health Systems, they said that only 633 cases of gender dysphoria were prescribed puberty blockers. Again, that sounds very small, but in 2021, the number was 1,390. Those numbers might not appear relatively high, but it's the rate of increase each year in these cases is what is significant to see. The trend shows an ever-growing number of 6 to 17-year-olds are, number one, being diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and number two, more of those cases every year are being prescribed puberty blockers to treat it. It is not an exaggeration to call the current youth gender identity situation a crisis. The data paints us this picture that I'm calling alarming and a crisis because it says more children and youth are identifying as transgender, gender dysphoria cases are on the rise, and the use of puberty blockers to treat gender dysphoria is also on the rise. It's also more likely the case in the United States that we all know someone identifying as transgender. We must equip ourselves with the necessary resources to think rightly about transgenderism so we can best help people struggling with their gender identity. This is no longer an issue unique to the big cities like New York City or Los Angeles. Gender identity issues are everywhere in America. So we've explained the basics of what transgenderism means and looked at some data. Let's look at this final section I want to cover and we'll close out this episode. What causes transgenderism? Do scientists know what causes someone to identify as a different gender from their birth gender? Is it a psychological reason, a biological reason? Is it a spiritual reason? Or is it on purpose, meaning volitional? Does someone just simply choose of their own voluntary free will to identify with the other gender? Are transgender people born that way? Can they not help it? Well, let me say this to start. To the present date of this, I'm recording this in December of 2024. To date, no scientific or medical expert has a definitive answer as to what causes transgenderism or gender dysphoria. There's, of course, theories out there. Let me just mention the main ones. One theory is that a transgender person's brain might be orientated towards a different gender, different from their physical reproductive organs. For example, and this is just being simplistic here, but you could have a person born as a biological male. So again, they have the male reproductive parts, but perhaps they have, for whatever reasons unknown to science, but perhaps they have a female-orientated brain. Or you could have the other way. Maybe someone was born with female reproductive organs, but they developed a male-orientated brain. So that theory asserts that the reason for transgenderism or gender identity issues is it's a body-brain divergence. Another influential theory is it could be genetics. Some have theorized that there might be a genetic link that causes transgenderism. As of this recording and the article that I wrote that accompanies this, again, December of 2024, there have been no conclusive, peer-reviewed, and accepted studies that prove a genetic or brain developmental cause for transgenderism or gender dysphoria. If there is someone out there claiming to be an expert on these matters, if they're honest, they have to admit they have no idea what causes transgenderism from a biological perspective. Occasionally, researchers have claimed a biological cause for transgenderism through empirical studies, such as brain scans or genetic testing. However, any of these so-called studies have failed to show any conclusive scientific evidence that transgenderism or gender dysphoria have a biological cause. Anyone who claims that science has proven transgender people are, quote, born that way, they're either ill-informed or just being outright dishonest. Again, I want to reiterate this point. There is no scientific proof that transgender people are born that way. One study found that 80% of adolescents who claimed they were transgender changed their minds and were no longer transgender in adulthood. A follow-up study conducted some years later to try and see if they could produce the same results, it did. So the follow-up study confirmed that roughly 80% of adolescents who at some point from, let's say, the ages 6 to 17, 18 or so, said, I might be transgender or I have gender dysphoria, they outgrew it. They changed their mind as they kept maturing. The evidence suggests the opposite of what you might hear in mainstream media. Transgender people are not born that way. The evidence suggests that most adolescents grow out of that as they age. I think that is logical. We all were younger and we were children and then teenagers and then we grew up into adulthood. How many times as children and teens do we change our mind of what we want to be when we grow up and who do we think we are and what are we interested in? Our brain matures, and that's what the data is rather showing is, for whatever reason, these young people thought they were wanting to identify as a different gender, but as they grew up, they said, you know what? I think I was wrong about all that. That's not exactly what I think anymore. People are not born with genes that cause them to question their gender identity as they grow up. Again, pop culture and its media wants us to think otherwise, but the popular claim is, well, these people cannot help it. It's what they're born with, but scientific data simply does not confirm that at all. Perhaps the cause of transgenderism is cultural rather than biological. I strongly believe American secular culture may be the actual cause of transgenderism, since it pressures, affirms, and encourages adolescents to question their gender identity. What does a Christian ethical perspective have to say on these matters? Well, we know that all issues people wrestle with ultimately have a spiritual root cause. Even the fact that our bodies, our physical bodies, they deal with illnesses and death, those facts link back to a spiritual problem that we call sin. Ever since Adam and Eve chose to break God's law and sin through their act of disobedience, humanity has dealt with the consequences of sin. You can read that in Genesis chapter 3. Not only do we deal with the consequences of sin, but we also have sin in our nature as people. We are sinful beings, sinful creatures in need of saving from both sin's penalty and the power of sin over us. Since we live in a sinful world and we are sinful people, we are drawn to a variety of sins and temptations that place us at odds with God's holy standards. Furthermore, one of the consequences of sin is that our minds are slanted and warped and bent towards sinful deviations. Not only do we engage in sinful actions, but also we have sinful lust and a sinful mind that pulls and draws and entices us to do sinful things. For example, Paul says in the book of Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, he says, and I'm summarizing him, the cause for homosexual activity is because their minds became so twisted by sin that they perverted the natural sexual functions of their bodies. Rather than men sexually desiring women and women sexually desiring men, men began to sexually desire men and women began to sexually desire women. Paul's point is that's not natural. That is proof that the mind has become so depraved by sin, it's been so tainted by it, that these lusts that people have become depraved and twisted as well. And then when people gave into those lusts, it has led to these sinful sexual desires and deviations. Well, Paul says what happened is God gave them over to follow the perverted desires of their hearts. Sin in the mind and heart was allowed to run rampant without restraint, and that leads to sexual deviations from God's holy standards. Paul's principles found there in Romans 1:18 through 32 can also help explain the root cause for gender identity issues or transgenderism. The root cause is spiritual. People's minds become depraved and bent towards sin to such a degree that they lose rational thinking due to the pressures of the sinful world around them as well and the sinful nature inside of them. It's actually not hard to see how some people become darkened in their thoughts to the degree they question even something basic as their gender identity. They begin to ignore the natural functions of their birth gender as God intended. James 1:14 through 15 says that there's a sort of process for how it is that we sin, commit sinful actions. He says, first, we're tempted and enticed by our own lusts and desires. James says it's as if our lusts carry us away. If we do not deal with our lust, then we will act on those lusts. The resulting action we take is the sin we engage in. James said it is as if lust gives birth to a child, and that child is sin. Then when that sin runs its course, the result is death. Due to the sinful pressures of the world we live in and the darkening effects of sin on people's minds, again, it's not surprising to me that some people question God's good gift of their own birth gender. Sin can cause detrimental effects on the heart and mind. They become lust if not dealt with in a God-honoring manner. A person may lust after being a different gender than their birth gender. That lust, again, if not dealt with, will be acted upon. The resulting actions will be sinful, and it keeps leading this person down a morally dark road. And it again just keeps twisting their mind to where they get to a point they can't even think straight. They can't even reason clearly any longer. The gender identity crisis and transgenderism are spiritual and moral issues, not psychological or biological. Again, we may see psychological symptoms, but the root cause, I am saying, is spiritual and moral, not psychological or biological. Well, I hope that this first episode of this series on transgenderism has helped give an understanding of the basics of what transgenderism is, and that some people undergo severe mental distress over it, and that's what's called gender dysphoria. The data again shows that gender identity issues is an ever-growing crisis, and it is significantly impacting adolescents. The root cause for transgenderism is spiritual and moral, not biological or psychological. Do not let popular culture trick you into believing people are, quote, born that way. People who question their gender identity were nurtured to do so with the help from their cultural environment, their peers, social media, and their own sinful inclinations, whether they realize it or not. Our job is to be the voice of truth and reason with a tone of grace. Thank you for listening to this episode of Careful Consideration. I hope the content was helpful to you, and in the next episode, I'll examine some key fallacies with current modern transgender theory that can help us work through that from a logical perspective. If you found this content helpful, please like it, share it out there, and if you're not subscribed to my website, please consider doing that. It's free. I don't use a paywall. You can find more content, including the articles I write, at www.dustinburden.com. Until next time.